I guess I'm not the typical entrant to this conference. I'm a medical student. So I expected this to be all about kind of political and economic risks that I didn't really understand very much. But so far in the last 2 days of the pre-conference, I guess I've come to realize that risk has a very broad definition. You can definitely have political, economic risks, but there are things to do with genetic risks. There are risks of sort of increased genetic sequencing leading to genetic privacy issues, for example, or risks to do with, I mean, I just came from a breakfast with the head of this pharmaceutical company, and he was talking about the risks of intellectual property, abuses of intellectual property in India, for example. So risks can have a very broad meaning, and I expected to be out of my depth in this economic, political sort of conference, but actually I'm finding there are a lot of medical science-related risks that are probably quite important for the next generation. To begin, I'll say genetic risks, or risks to do with genetic privacy. I think this is a huge emerging trend that we'll see in the coming generation. Genetic sequencing technology has become much cheaper than it ever has been before, and now for under $100 you can have part of your DNA sequenced and a risk profile developed for you, which tells you your risk of developing a whole bunch of different diseases. That's only going to become more prominent over the next generation within our lifetimes, and that carries a whole bunch of risks of its own, risks to do with how to protect this genetic information. For example, you know, that information is very useful for finding treatments for patients, but what if it got into the wrong hands? What if it got into the hands of insurance companies or employers? That could be disastrous for people with an unfavorable genetic outlook. So I guess risk one is the risk of genetic information being abused, and genetic privacy getting out of hand. The second risk that humanity is facing, I'll say the aging population. I think the population dynamics of most of the developed world is bulging out in the side of the elderly. This is a combination of lower birth rates, and so the population pyramid is narrower down the bottom, as well as increased or improved medical care, which means that people are living longer. And so as a result, we get this inverted population pyramid with a huge amount of elderly people to a level that we've never really seen before in history. And I think that'll have a huge effect on how social structures work. Insurance companies will need to cope to deal with the increasing health costs. Employment structures will need to change because old people will be sort of taking up the jobs for longer. There may not be as much open space and flexibility for new, younger workers to come into the workforce. These are just some of the issues that we'll need to face as sort of the population pyramid bulges towards the top end. I guess medicine is all about evaluating risks and probabilities. You have a set of symptoms and you make a differential diagnosis, a number of possible outcomes, each with their associated probabilities, and whenever you make a decision, you're taking a risk because you're working on incomplete information. So in that respect, on a professional sort of level, I guess I could call myself a risk taker, but more broadly, maybe as a young person and someone from Australia, I guess the risk that I'm interested in is the risk of putting yourself in an uncomfortable position by traveling halfway across the world to come, say, to a Swiss conference, or to just go backpacking through South America, which I did last year. So the risks of, I guess I have two kinds of risk-taking in my life. I have medical risk-taking and kind of just random student traveling risk-taking.